What is up, guys? It's Austin from Jones Bros Garage back today for another great video. And today we will be talking about the life and recent death of the Yamaha YZF R6. The R6 was initially released in 1999, roughly about a year after the R1, and it was the baby brother to the R1, although it was a very different bike than the R1. It was the more track-focused, sporty brother of the YZF 600R, which was also made alongside the R6 for some time. As I mentioned, and as you may know because this still holds true today, it's a very different bike than the R1. It's supposed to be a lighter, more nimble chassis, and it's a lot more rev happy. So starting out with the Generation 1 R6 and the 1999 to 2000 model years, they really laid the foundation for the modern R6. They revved up to 15,500 RPMs, and they made a lot of their power up high, and it was a very nimble bike compared to the bigger R1. It had a 599cc dual overhead cam 4-cylinder, as it always has for its entire life. And even the first year of the R6 made a claimed 120 horsepower and around 50 foot-pounds of torque. Now that's claimed, so what it actually made might vary. People tend to say around 100 wheel horsepower, which for 1999 is really good out of 599 cc's in a 4-stroke. In fact, it was the first production 4-stroke at 600 cc's to make 100 horsepower. And all of this with a curb weight of just under 430 pounds. And supposedly the first years of the R6 already had a top speed of around 155 miles per hour. So still in Generation 1, we had the 01 to 02 Yamaha R6. They made a few tweaks to the engine for better mid-range power, and they changed the tail light a little bit. But generally the bike still looked pretty similar to the first years. The horsepower bump brought the motor up to around 107 wheel horsepower and around 44 foot-pounds of torque at the wheel. The weight of the bike was reduced very slightly, around 3 pounds, and the bike got better tires. It also was given a more comfortable handlebar angle and a little extra storage space underneath the seat. So that brings us to the second generation of the Yamaha R6, which started in 2003. So for the 2003 and 2004 model years, we received a completely new chassis, 90% new engine components. This is where we see the bike gets fuel injection. It had new styling, it had new wheels, and the weight was reduced to around 415 pounds for 03, and then back up to 419 for 04. And again, that is wet weight. The bike now was making roughly 115 horsepower at the wheel and still around 44 to 45 foot-pounds of torque. For 2005, we had some bigger upgrades, still in the second generation. The motor now made around 118 to 119 horsepower at the wheel and around 45 foot-pounds of torque still. But the big upgrades are, this is where we saw the front tire go from a 120/60 to a modern 120/70 that the Yamaha R6 carried all the way until its death. The 43mm fork was also swapped for a 41mm inverted fork, which is more modern. And we also saw upgraded brakes with 310mm discs in the front, with radial calipers and a Brembo master cylinder. All of this saw the bike climb in weight a little bit to around 424 pounds wet. Now that all brings us to Generation 3. This is where the R6 really kind of became its modern self that we know today. And also there was some controversy. This generation went from 2006 to 2016, and there were some major changes initially, and after that a lot of them were minor. And I'll go ahead and touch on everything that was done over the years of this generation. So for 2006, they started adding more power to the motor, and in the end they ended up with a completely different bike. This bike was now more track focused and less street focused. As I said, it's more similar to the modern R6s that we had recently. The bike now makes more horsepower, around 125 to 130 horsepower, which is ludicrous, and you'll see from this generation onward, the horsepower actually starts to go down. The bike was 417 pounds wet, so it lost some weight. So in the motor we had new camshafts, bigger throttle bodies, revised fuel injection, and revised intake funnels. They stiffened up the bike, so they had to redesign the frame to fit a new swing arm linkage. And as I said, this is really where we started to see the modern R6, because this bike was noted to have a little bit heavier of a front end, felt a little bit more stable, but it made all of its power up high, and it lacked power in the low to mid-range RPMs. It really made all of its power up high, which is what the most recent R6 was really known for. This bike also received a slipper clutch, and it got YCCT, which is electronic throttle control. This is the first production bike to ever have this, and it really set the trend for ride-by-wire. Now, all of this didn't come without controversy. Yamaha claimed that the bike revved to 17,500 RPMs, which was absolutely ludicrous. But the thing is, the bike actually didn't. When people hooked these up to dynos, they started to realize that when the tachometer was saying 17,500, the bike wasn't actually at 17,500. In fact, the tachometer was wrong, and Yamaha had the tachometer slightly off from where the motor truly was. The motor was believed to rev in actuality around 16,200 RPMs, which is still really good, but it doesn't change the fact that Yamaha was falsely advertising the rev limiter on this bike. And for that reason, Yamaha actually had to offer to buy back any bikes that people weren't satisfied with. I don't know if anybody did end up selling their bikes back to Yamaha. I couldn't find anything on that. It'd be interesting to see if anybody did, but if you would have had one of these first year Gen 3 R6s and you weren't happy with the fact that they lied about the RPMs, Yamaha would have bought your bike back for the full price. Now, we didn't see much change in 2007. However, they did fix the tachometer, which is good. I mean, I'm sure that was a liability for them that they needed to fix. And now for 2008 is where we see some tweaks. 2008, among a lot of people, is known to be the best year for the R6, because 2008 is the year that the R6 made the most power, because after this, you'll see that emissions laws start dampening the power on the motor, and they never really redesigned the motor. So basically, from this point on, the R6 just begins to make less power. So for 2008, they added something called YCCI, which is where the intake funnel or the intake tubes can change their length, their variable length. They could be long tubes or short tubes, depending on the RPMs you're at, which basically just gives the motor better response and more power. They also went to a little bit larger of a bore in the motor, and there were some tweaks with cosmetics on the fairings. There were also a couple tweaks on the frame, and the compression went from 12.8 to 1 to 13.8 to 1, where it ended up staying until the death of the R6. The bike was now around 415 pounds wet, which is pretty light. As I've mentioned, this bike had the best power to weight ratio of any R6 ever made. And with that said, the bike was still around 130 horsepower. It's hard to find an exact figure, but you could say that the '08 R6, fresh from the factory, was around 130 horsepower. So in 2009, we saw a slight remap for the EPA. I haven't ridden these two, the 2008 and the 2009, so I don't know what the difference is. Supposedly it's pretty minor, but regardless, the '09 did make a tiny bit less power than the '08. And then for 2010 all the way to 2016, there were really no changes. They made the exhaust a little bit longer, again, for emissions, but that's about it. I'm sure this is due to the state of the economy at the time, and also the fact that there was declining interest in this 600cc super sport class of motorcycle. So finally, that brings us to the final, most recent generation of the R6, the Generation 4. This bike was released in 2017 and ran to 2020. The motor was pretty much the exact same as the '08, so they didn't redesign it, but now they had to conform to Euro 4. So the motor was dampened to around 115 horsepower, As I mentioned before, it does not make as much power as the previous generation did, simply because it's the exact same motor, but now they have more EPA and emissions laws. This is the R6 that we know today. It was modeled after the R1. If you don't know anything about the generations of these bikes, the R1 looked like the R1 before the R6. The new R6 looked the way it does, if that makes sense. Like they made the new looking R1 at the same time they made the Gen 3 R6. And then with this 2017 model R6, they designed it to look more like the R1, which I don't personally like because I feel like it takes away from the R1. But regardless, it did make the R6 look pretty awesome. They also switched the front fork to a KYB 43mm inverted fork off of the R1, and we had an adjustable KYB rear shock. So this bike has some pretty serious suspension on it. We also saw the start of electronics in the R6. We had switchable rider modes, switchable traction control, and ABS, and an optional quick shifter for up only. The bike received a new magnesium subframe and an aluminum fuel tank, which both helped to save a little bit of weight on the bike over the 08 to 16 models. And the front discs were bumped up from 310 millimeters to 320 millimeters. This left us with a wet weight of around 419 pounds, and as I mentioned, around 115 horsepower. So not quite as good as the 08 to 16. However, the handling definitely improved with the suspension updates, and I could say that the power still feels plenty because my brother actually owned this bike for a while and I made a couple videos on it. But it does make all of its power up high, similar to how the 08 to 16s did, and it does just all around feel like a great handling bike. I don't think you're missing a lot by losing that 10 to 15 horsepower. But then again, I've never ridden the 08, so I can't really say that for sure. So that leads us to the death of the YZF R6 as we know it. 2021, the R6 was no longer made, along with many other bikes, and that is partially and mainly due to the fact that bike manufacturers now have to adhere to Euro 5. So I'm sure they didn't want to redesign a whole new motor for this R6. I mean, they haven't since 2008, so why would they now? And if they would have conformed to Euro 5, it would have just dampened the power even more, and we would just end up to keep getting R6s with less and less power, which is kind of pointless. So they just killed the R6 altogether, along with many other bikes, like for instance the WR250R that I owned. They no longer make. There also is a declining interest in 600cc super sport motorcycles, specifically inline fours. People now are moving more towards twins. People are moving towards naked bikes. So the 600cc super sport class isn't really, it's a class that a lot of people like to talk about and they like to look at, but if you look at the sales numbers, people just simply are not buying them. So with that said, in replacement of the R6, Yamaha released the R7, which obviously is a very, very different bike. It's kind of a mix between the MT-07 and the Yamaha R6. My friend had one for a while. Unfortunately, he got rid of it, so I haven't got to ride one yet. I really do want to ride one, and I actually am debating maybe buying one as a track bike. Obviously, if you know anything about these bikes, they aren't an inline four-cylinder. They still sit sporty. They still have sporty ergonomics, but not as extreme as the R6. And they make way less power than the R6. I believe around 70 to 75 horsepower. I'll paste it right here. I forget the exact numbers. But that's what we're left with now. If you want a street bike from Yamaha below the R1 in the super sport class, kind of, you have the R7. It's not really in the super sport class, I guess, you know. It's kind of below that. It's more closer to the Ninja 650, but it still has super sport ergonomics, and I'm sure it's a great bike. It's just, it's not an R6. However, the R6 is not completely dead. For 2022, we do get the YZF R6 GYTR, which is a track-only, race-focused variant of the YZF R6. So basically, this is an R6 without all the lights and street things on it. It has a full Akrapovic race exhaust. It comes with the up-only quick shifter standard. It has a GYTR ECU. It has a lightweight wiring harness and an ABS emulator so that you don't get an ABS light on your dash from not having your ABS. It also had a 1546 520 sprockets and 520 chain. It has stainless steel brake lines. It has more race-focused rear sets. It has a reverse shift kit, like GP shift. So you click down to shift up, and you click up to shift down, which is more beneficial for track riding, but we won't get into that. It also came with a rear stand and rear hooks, so right from the factory you could get that rear wheel off the ground. And then it has various guards on it, chain guard, sprocket guard, just a couple different guards that you would want for a track bike. It has race fairings. They only come in unpainted white, which, for the price you pay, I don't know that I'm too happy with that, but that is the case. And it comes with a racing seat, whatever that means. It comes with a more race-focused seat from Yamaha. But this bike is $18,399, and they are made to order. So you have to order it to get one. $18,400 plus tax and everything. Very expensive. In fact, it's more than a liter bike, and it's way more expensive than the normal street variant R6 was. Not completely sure if that's worth it. If you're really into track, maybe, but you probably could build something better for cheaper. So basically the R6 is dead. That's all we have left now. So the R6 made its debut in 1999, and its death was in 2020. It lived a great 21 years because it was a very loved bike. It was featured in many magazines as Bike of the Year over the years, especially early when it first came out. It's had some success in racing, and it's kind of a staple track bike. If you are somebody that rides on the track, obviously you know what an R6 is. It's a pretty staple bike for the track. And it really was class leading. Like I said, a big thing is they created ride-by-wire. Like, manufacturers were using ride-by-wire electronic throttle control in MotoGP bikes, but Yamaha was the first to bring it to a street bike, and that was with this Yamaha R6. The bike was class leading for many years. The ZX6R made more power off and on throughout the years. However, it also was cheating with a 636cc motor. But regardless of that, the R6 was class leading for 600cc. It was making the most power. It was a great handling bike, and it didn't have a lot of issues. The only really big thing was the tachometer controversy in 2006. It is a little bit unfortunate to see this bike go, but hopefully we see some new cool bikes come in. Emissions kind of ruin everything, really. So guys, if you enjoyed this video, then go ahead and give that subscribe button a little finger action. I'm back in my groove of posting every week, coming up on 5,000 subscribers, which is really cool. I'm glad that you guys support me. I really appreciate it. And I also want to hear your feedback. Let me know if there's any videos you want to see from me. And also, go ahead and leave some comments about the R6. Did you love the R6? Or do you own one? Or do you hate the R6 and you're happy to see it go? I'm sure that's few and far between because the R6 was a very loved bike, but you never know. Everybody has different opinions. I personally am pretty sad to see it go. It really was a fun bike. I enjoyed riding it. At least with my brothers, it was a 2018. The throttle was very smooth. I loved how smooth the throttle was. That's one thing I definitely could note about that bike. But that about does it for this video. Until next time, see you guys.